Pleistocene, which was the past epoch of time, and then the Holocene, which is the current time we're in terms of epochs. So the Pleistocene is a pretty interesting period. It started about 2.5 million years ago, and kind of what really separates the Pleistocene was it's what, you know, there was the ice ages, or there was, you know, all these long periods of time when, you know, a lot of the Earth's water was locked up in these really thick glaciers. But then they also had these interglacial periods of warming. And so there was a lot of fluctuation in sea level, where at times, you know, the sea level was 400 foot below current levels. And then there was times that it was 15 or 30, 50 foot above what it currently is. And then there's, you know, there's quite a bit of, you know, during those glaciation periods, a lot of shifts in the flora. And so I think we still kind of see that, and that's kind of what we'll talk about briefly here. As you can see on this map, this was the last big glaciation, the Wisconsin Glacier, and you can see how far it crept down into the U.S., into, you know, Ohio, North Dakota, Minnesota. And, you know, you can see on the map the kind of the blue lines within the white, which is the glacier. You know, some of the ice sheets up there were, you know, 2,500 foot thick. And then if you look at, and I can provide these slides so y'all can study them more closely. I know there's a lot of information here. You can kind of see below the glaciation, you know, that's kind of the boreal and the taiga forest there, and even probably permafrost coming down, so like even tundra conditions. And then kind of in the eastern US, you can see jack pine and tundra in the higher elevations of the Appalachians. But then what's interesting is you look at kind of where Texas is now, and you see warm, temperate broadleaf forests. So there was quite a bit of probably what would be more northern species now. So true sugar maple, probably northern red oak, a lot of species you anticipate seeing, you know, silver maple. You know, further north of here, we're probably pretty dominant species, kind of following, you know, the preferred, you know, climatic variations. And then I think one more thing to note is you can kind of see in the southern part where Texas is, the dashed line within the green is, you know, the current coastline, but you can see the dark line, how much further, you know, the land projected out. And there was, I think, quite a bit of, because of that, you had a decent amount of species kind of training in areas now that are currently within the Gulf of Mexico's waters. And then briefly touching on it, you know, there was a lot of different faunal species that were present during the Pleistocene that aren't currently here. I mean, to be honest, you know, North America's megafauna looked a lot more like what's currently, you know, African savanna fauna. So it might give us a little indication that, you know, maybe these forested systems were not nearly as dense as we thought they were. And between the mega, you know, herbivores and then, you know, disruption events like fire, potentially, you know, savanna conditions might have been a lot more prevalent during the Pleistocene. And then briefly on Pleistocene vegetation, you know, out west, you know, unless you're in the high elevations, a lot of the you know, coniferous species aren't that common, but it was anticipated that out in, you know, West Texas in the Pecos area now, that area would have had, you know, these big depressional playa lakes, which are basically closed cell wetland systems, probably quite a bit of, you know, true more grassland savanna conditions that were pretty moist, in what would be more the Pecos deserty area now. And then, you know, the mountains would probably have been pretty large forest of conifers. In East Texas, and we kind of briefly hit on this, was, you know, I think a lot of the you know, genera level would have been similar, oak, you know, pine and hickory species, but a lot of the cooler species that are now kind of restricted to northern latitudes would have probably been a lot more common. And I have a picture of smooth alder here in the top part. When you look at borings of bogs that go back about 15, 20,000 years in Texas that have a pretty good pollen record, alders are really common in central Texas. And now you can kind of see here in the range map, there's just a few outliers kind of in the central part of the state now. But most of those bogs are not even where alders recorded anymore. And alders really kind of restricted to kind of acidic smaller stream systems within kind of the deep East Texas and the piney woods and a little bit into the post oak savanna. And then you see this last slide, or last bullet says relic populations. I think a really interesting and good example of relic, even though it's not in Texas, is the Florida yew. It's a small evergreen shrub that now is pretty much restricted to 2 or 3 counties in the Apalachicola river basin in the panhandle of Florida. And it's pretty much restricted to these really deep ravines that have these really cool microclimates. They pretty much occur entirely within shade, but you can see its nearest relative is the Canada yew. And there's a little bit of the species that dips down into North Carolina in the higher elevations of the Appalachians, but you really don't pick it up as common until you get into the very, northern continental 48 states in the eastern US. So I think that, these kind of relic species or relic populations kind of show how, the Pleistocene, during those cooler times, you had a pretty far southern extension of what would be northern species now. And then another, I think it's an interesting thing is it's called seed dispersal anachronisms. And I really like the quote, ghost of past mutualism, where certain species now like honey locust and bodark or hedge apple produce these really large fruits with a lot of carbohydrate reserves, but generally very few seeds. And, when there's a bunch of, large herbivores running around like mammoths and mastodons and, giant ground sloths, this would have been a very palatable item for them. They would have easily consumed it. And the benefit for the plant was producing that much of a high energy fruit would be, these herbivores would eat it and then walk, miles away from the parent and, excrement out a nice packaged seed with a bunch of nutrients to where there wasn't a lot of competition between the juveniles of a parent. But now, coming out of the Pleistocene, and I don't know, you can get into the whole, how did all these megafauna become extinct? And I don't want to crack that can of worms, but for the most part, about 75% of them are gone, and all of the ones that weighed over, a ton are no longer, well, I guess you're outside of bison and pretty much bison, are extinct. And then coming into the Holocene, the end of the Pleistocene, it ended pretty abruptly about 16,000 years ago. And for the most part, really rapid warming of the weather, about 11 degrees Fahrenheit in the matter of, a couple thousand years. As a result, and will be important once we get into some of the community types, especially the riverine systems, there's a big deal with the rise in that in terms of how rivers respond to basically their endpoint, which would be the oceans. And so coming into the Holocene, we talked about, the rapid, rise in temperatures, but overall the Holocene era has been quite a bit drier and warmer overall than kind of the last glaciation. And we see a pretty big shift in vegetation, especially in the southern United States. You see what we say, more northern species kind of, constrict back up to northern latitudes. And then a pretty big explosion of the pines in the southeastern United States. And then also, the rise of humans, especially with the agrarian revolution coming out of, Mesopotamia. And how much that influenced, the world in terms of, humans populating a really large swath of the world. And then definitely, the industrial revolution really, really impacted, how, humans interact with every other species on this planet. And then just briefly, this is a geologic map of kind of the coastal plain. We're going to focus kind of in that black box there. So kind of Houston to the Sabine, Louisiana border. We're going to focus mostly on these kind of southern 5 or 6 geologies, the Beaumont and the Lissy, which are kind of the lighter colors, would be typically the prairie areas. And then as you kind of get north, you feed into savanna and forested conditions. Oh, so real fast. So I'm going to cover prairies and flatwoods together. There's some similarities and some differences, but I think in terms of these non-living factors, the abiotic factors, they're very similar in terms of kind of what dictate plants abundance. So for the most part, here's the two kind of ranges of the bottom would be the prairies, and the top would be the flatwoods. And you can kind of see they're basically the flatwoods begin as soon as the prairies end on the coast, especially the upper coast. I would say since we're focusing on kind of the upper coast, both receive quite a bit of rainfall. The prairies are normally located in those two younger geologic formations, the Beaumont and the Lissy formation. The flatwoods are normally associated with kind of what I call like no man's land, kind of between major river systems, where they're kind of on these big Pleistocene terraces where during the Pleistocene, during higher rain events, the floodplains would have been a lot bigger, and now they're kind of these abandoned floodplains. And then once you start kind of getting into kind of the micro topography, and why I kind of lump these together is, you could say they're flat surfaces, but they have quite a bit of micro topography because of, water and wind erosion. There's a series of, ridge and swell and depressional complexes. And then a lot of times there's also mima mounds, which are thought to be driven by, wind during droughtier conditions. And then, the Beaumont formation is a little different since it's a really heavy clay on top. It's got a process called gilgai, where it's a shrink swell clay soils. I won't cover that too much, but for the most part, outside of that last formation right along the coast of Beaumont, most of the soils are sandy and sandy loams, but they generally have a clay underlayer. We'll talk briefly about that. And for the most part, the coastal prairie and the flatwoods herbaceous communities, so non-woody communities, very, very similar. It's got a lot of influence from the Great Plains flora, and it derives a lot of the grasses and legumes and sunflowers from kind of that Great Plains pushing south, with little blue stem being really, really dominant in a lot of these community types. But it's got a lot of southeastern coastal plain flora, which is pretty unique. And generally it's really sedge heavy, with a couple different genera of sedges that are really dominant, as well as a lot of acidic species. And those are really tied a lot to the pines. The pines really, the drought pine needles really increase acidity of soils. And just a couple of plants is, I got a picture of little blue stem here in the bottom right, you can kind of see a nice patch of, that's Texas coneflower. And then I think that's prairie blazing star, but you can see a little bit of brown in there, and that's angle stem beak sedge. And then, the upper right is piney woods drop seed. It's not as common on the prairies. You can find it in some nice patches, generally kind of the base of mima mounds. But then on the far left, you get into, some pretty interesting species like snowy orchid, where, orchids to me, when I see them on the landscape, they're really indicative that, that ground has not been disturbed very much. And just because they're such, orchids they basically don't give their seeds any kind of nutrients. And so the seeds basically have to form a mutualistic relationship with mycorrhizae or fungal in the soil to actually build their root system that then allows them to produce, above ground leaves and reproductive parts. And just a couple more species are really common. Some of these are common in both prairies and flatwoods, and some are pretty much only in flatwoods. Musky mint is in the mint family, Lamiaceae. The next one over is single stem bog aster, Eurybia hemisphaerica. It's common in both. Short bristled beak sedge is a very wet sedge, common in both flatwoods and prairies. Bottom left, brown seed paspalum. And I think that genera of paspalum is kind of indicative of more the coastal plain. There's a lot of diversity down here, but as you kind of go northward, you lose a lot of diversity of that genus. Pale pitcher plants, flatwoods. It's interesting because sometimes you can find it in flatwoods and these kind of like just really acidic kind of just flats between, next to bagals and these terracines. But you can also find it as you kind of go further north in East Texas on slope bogs, where there's actually, 15 to 30% slopes. And then sharp blazing star is pretty common throughout both main habitat types. And then flatwoods, kind of what differentiates flatwoods is obviously it's got a lot more of a woody component to it. And depending on where you're at, we have a map of that coming up, is it more deciduous heavy, broadleaf heavy, or is it more pine heavy? And that kind of dictates, I think there might be, depends on what the driver is, but that generally influences soil pH, which can influence overall plant composition. And generally speaking, loblollies and longleaf pines, the two dominants within the system. Loblollies more mixed in with the oaks and the broadleaf species, whereas longleaf generally almost kind of forms monocultures of just longleaf, and it's a really interesting species we'll talk a little bit more about. So I think we have a slide covering the oaks, but yeah, there's a good mixture of these broadleaf plants and more the deciduous flatwoods area. And then depending on where you're at, dwarf palmetto can oftentimes form this almost just monoculture within certain flatwoods systems, especially in the deciduous systems. And so I have a meme here in the middle is me explaining the difference between Quercus species. They can be very difficult. So the oaks can be very difficult. There's a lot of diversities in the flatwoods. And I mean, we won't focus too much on that, but water oak, cherry bark, laurel oak, willow oak, bottomland or delta post oak, which I'd say on that one is, if you see a post oak down in Houston area, it's probably bottomland post oak, and you can turn it over. And if it doesn't have these stellate hairs or star-shaped hairs in the back, it's probably bottomland post oak. And it doesn't have the deep sinews and kind of the cross-like shape of true post oak. So it's one to look for. But there's also swamp chestnut, overcup oak, southern red oak, and shumard. And I'd say that certain ones of these, like cherry bark and willow oak, are generally an overcup, are normally a lot wetter and can handle periods of being basically their feet wet within some inundation, whereas the other ones normally like it a little bit drier. They can handle saturation, but not long periods of being really wet. And just briefly, so here's kind of the distribution. And I think this was found in Illustrated Flora of East Texas. So it's a good map to study. I think this was produced in the 1930s. It kind of shows the different, habitat types in East Texas. So, the very southern part, the white, is the coastal prairie. And then kind of talking about the two differences in the flatwoods is kind of the bright green. That's going to be a more deciduous loblolly flatwood system. It's not nearly as dissected as the areas north. And as you can see, as you move up, follow the green, it gets a lot slimmer. And so it's kind of the light green is around kind of smaller tributaries to the main river systems. And then the longleaf communities are kind of restricted to that kind of the darker yellow. And that is a tan color. And longleaf normally kind of occurs in the flat areas between kind of the dissected floodplains of the smaller tributaries. And longleaf is really interesting because it can be in really wet conditions, and then it can be in really xeric or really dry conditions and really deep sands. And so kind of talking about some of the hydrology, the hydrologic conditions is, just the climate of southeastern Texas is really extreme. We have periods of, really high rainfalls, but also really droughty conditions. And that would be, say, an average year. Normally it's really wet in wintertime. And as you get into spring, later in spring, it dries out quite a bit with, periodic, thunderstorms. But then you can get hit with, big hurricane systems that dump, 20 to, what did Harvey dump? 60, 70 inches. And then, the thing is, kind of already briefly touched on this, is there's quite a bit of, micro topography within these systems. And as a result, different areas will collect water over time and different areas will stay quite a bit drier. And that leads to a lot of kind of niche formation within these plant communities, to where I think that's why it lends themselves to high diversity. It's not one, monotypic, level ground. And this really leads to, mosaic type conditions, to where, you have a lot of plants kind of stacked on top of each other, but they they really kind of get little bands, especially the herbaceous or the non-woody species really kind of favor certain little micro niches. But I would say the one thing in East Texas, and really throughout a lot of East Texas is broad, I would say that's the piney woods, the prairies, and the post oak savanna. There's normally a clay layer somewhere, and we'll talk about that on this next slide. So you can see here kind of in the bottom of this graph, it says occluded aquifer. So that's normally a clay, and clay basically is really, really fine particles to where, even when they're not that waterlogged, they're binded so close from a molecular standpoint, they let hardly any water go through them. And as a result, if you have a soil kind of like a sandy loam on top of that, you can pool water in that sandy loam because it's got a lot bigger pores between the actual sediment particles. But then when it hits the aquifer, it really doesn't go any further down. And as a result, you see this landscape where between this slide and the next one, we'll see how they kind of basically trade water. During periods of high precipitation to where basically rainfall is greater than evapotranspiration, so evaporation and transpiration, which transpiration is basically plants uptaking water and then releasing water into the atmosphere, that the mounds and the inner mounds, the flat areas, basically shoot all their water both from surface flow and subsurficial or ground flow on top of that occluded aquifer to the lowest point. So just gravity working basically. And so you're filling up these reservoirs of depressions with water. And then as we go to the next slide, where evapotranspiration exceeds precipitation, is you see these depressions acting as reservoirs to kind of the rest of the area. So then instead of overland flows, it's subterranean flows coming in to where I think that's a lot to do with kind of hydrostatic pressure, osmotic pressure is pulling that water into areas that should be quote unquote drier than the depressions, but it allows them to persist and have a lot longer periods of moisture. And as a result, there's a lot of vegetation banding that occurs, with these depression areas out into the flatter areas. And you get a lot of niche development. We briefly talked on that, but you can kind of see my poorly drawn red lines here is you kind of have typical communities you form with water depth. So like below the first, the bottom red line is you see thalia, powdery thalia. So it can handle pretty deep water. And then between those, two lines kind of on top of that, you can see some water lilies. So that's probably your deepest portion of this depressional wetland. And this is actually taken at Sheldon Lake, if y'all ever want to visit out there. So during the deepest parts are 18, 24 inches, and they're going to have the floating leaf rooted plants. And then kind of the vegetation banding, it looks really brown. It's probably square stem spike rush or Gulf spike rush. Pretty robust, can handle 12 inches of standing water for quite some time. Then the banding is kind of that dark green. It's probably arrowhead and a couple of species of the more robust spike sedges or spike rushes, and also probably even beak sedge. And then as you kind of get to the top part of the picture where it's not the trees, kind of below the trees, that's probably more of your traditional prairie with big blue stem, little blue stem, gamma grass. Probably some of the sedges that can't handle near the moisture. And then the other really big driver, I would say, for this community type is fire. And I would say of all these, forces that influence plant communities, they all interact together. But fire is a really, really interesting one. It acts almost as an herbivore where it removes a lot of plant biomass, raw biomass, whether that be either just living material or also dead material from accumulating. And it really alleviates a lot of times competition, especially for bare ground. So it allows for a lot of germination of plant species. And for more perennial plants, especially herbaceous species, it really promotes reproduction and regeneration from below ground living biomass. It also selects for, pyric or fire adapted species and communities. And that's really a lot of times related to how frequently fires would have burned. So I would say in the southeastern part of the state, fires are pretty common historically, occurring every 3 to 5 years. And I'm sure during some years faster than that. And kind of going along with the next bullet, kind of going along with the hydrology, is it creates habitat heterogeneity. I think it really promotes, kind of niche formation, especially when it's coupled with, other factors that are kind of influencing where plants are able to root and grow and be robust and to compete against other species. And then another critical one is it really recycles nutrients. So a lot of times, nutrients will get locked up into basically unavailable forms, say within dead biomass of plants. And fire and ash is a really good way to get those nutrients back into living organisms. So just real fast about longleaf, it's one of my favorite plants. It's just a fire adapted species, and basically the name of the game is it's called protect the apical meristem. So the apical meristem is basically the point where the plant grows from, and you can see here on the left kind of the stages of the longleaf is it germinates from seed, forms this little wispy kind of grassy looking thing, and then it enters this grass stage. And I say that grass stage doesn't do near the justice of what it actually looks like, because it's normally like the needles are like about a 45-degree angle, and they're 10, 12-inch needles. And that apical meristem sits way down there in the base of that grass stage, to where basically that angle of the needles when fire comes through, basically almost wicks away the fire from that middle part. And it's really important. It sits there for years at times, and it grows this really elaborate, network of roots to where it starts storing a lot of energy below ground. And then as you can see there, it's got this bottle brush stage, or I call it the bolting stage. And you see a lot of those bolting stages in the actual photo. It shoots up 5-6 foot within a year, to where basically it jumps up above, fire height, and puts the apical meristem really high in the air as quickly as possible. And then as the species matures, it basically loses all of its lower branches, to where it trims them off, to where there's not what's called ladder fuels up to the canopy, to where the bark is resistant to fire, so it doesn't bother more mature trees. And so it's really adapted to fire. So that's a really good example of how fire can influence the actual evolutionary strategies of a species. And you can see here in this map, this is basically cloud to ground, lightning strikes. You can see how prevalent it is in Texas, and just kind of the coastal plain in general. And this is, historically was the main driver of a fire within the area. And you got to think, before, I would say, modernity and roadways everywhere, that fire might have, lightning might have struck one area, but it could have burned millions of acres, because it would never have had a barrier to basically put the fire out. Let's see how we're doing on time. I guess I can stop real. I think there's a couple questions. Let me stop real fast, and I can see what these questions are. I can answer these really fast. So Mary asked, do dams on Texas rivers tip the battle between the Gulf and the rivers to favor the Gulf? That's probably a question really it's a time scale. I mean, all this stuff is really almost fractal in nature. It potentially could. I mean, if the dams are trapping a bunch of sediment behind there, it might not promote as rapid, expansion of land. But I think with Texas, with the barrier islands, maybe that's not as important. I would say definitely Louisiana and the Mississippi River. That's where, between loss of sediment, basically expanding the delta out into the Gulf, and then also subsidence, that it's a lot bigger impact to Louisiana. And then let's see, Clifton asked, do you know any resources to learn about the microsite selection of invasive species in periodically inundated areas? Let me see. That one, I mean, if you read some of the ID plant books with species description, it'll talk a little bit about kind of what species occur where. There's a couple good papers out there that I can dig them up and provide those that talk about it. I think there's some better ones in the post-oak savanna, honestly, about some of the bog species and where they occur. But yeah, that one's probably not quite as good in terms of really kind of the microsite or the kind of the niches that kind of band out. I haven't seen really great ones, especially for, I would say, the coastal prairie. Jason Singhurst with Texas Parks has published some pretty good literature on that. Well, I don't know if it's even published, but he's got some pretty good stuff. So going on, we'll talk about bottomland hardwoods, and then we'll be done. So bottomland hardwoods, I call them, the dissection of the landscape. So these are big riverine system where, that's a low point in the landscape where all the water from the entire drainage eventually makes its way to the ocean. You can see here on the right where, Pleistocene if the elevation of the Gulf was 400 foot below where it is now, there would have been a lot more slope to these river systems. And as a result, would have carved a lot deeper valleys. But when the sea levels rose, you would have had these systems fill up over time to kind of what they currently are. And for the most part, these are really young sediments. They predominantly were sourced during the Holocene. But kind of like we talked about before, there's a lot of topographic diversity within floodplains and in their terraces. But it's normally from different features. Or it's really heavily driven by water erosion and then sediment deposition. So water erosion, and then also the sediment deposition is really reflective of just water velocities associated with, I would say that, the main stem or the actual river. And so we're kind of going to walk through kind of where these different communities occur based on kind of elevation in relation to the actual river itself. So if you look here, on this little diagram to the north or to the top, you can see the river base flow and a dip down where it's white with the black line on top of it. That would be, say, the active river. So let's call it the Neches River. You can see immediately adjacent to it is there's this bar, and my thing's hiding from me, but let's call that the levee. The bar and levee system is, that's right next to the main river. It's got a lot of velocity coming down. And also when you have, sediment laden floodwaters, sand is a very heavy molecule. It settles out really rapidly. So it's probably going to settle out right there. So it's a really harsh environment, and there's not many species that can live there, but the ones that we do, we should be grateful for because they're fast colonizers. They have extensive rooting systems, and they can stabilize sand. So they really help reduce long-term erosions on stream banks and kind of hold the rivers and the streams together. And you can see here, there's only normally a couple species: black willow, American sycamore, eastern cottonwood, and river birch. There's a couple other ones, but there's just not a lot that can handle that level of erosion associated being directly next to rivers, especially large river systems that, have high velocities and stay inundated underneath, deep floodwaters for quite some time. And then as you kind of walk away from the main river system into the floodplain, that's where you have a lot more topography. So these areas flood frequently because, for the most part, they're within systems that once the river kind of pops its banks, it's within these areas, but a lot lower velocities, generally speaking. And they're not going to be flooded for as long. They're only going to probably be flooded mostly during, active flood stage of a river or a stream system. This is where you start getting a lot more diversity. I have a couple of the keystone species here. Top right is swamp locust. Bottom left is water hickory working your way over, overcup oak, cedar elm, nut oak. And then I would say that, I only have woody species here, but but normally there's really good canopy coverage here. You normally have almost a full canopy. And really you only get gaps in the canopy when you have normally mature species die, and you have light gaps. Something called hydrology is really common, especially within herbaceous species here, which would be, seed dispersal via moving water. And so a lot of times with more of the shade tolerant, robust sedges, you have a little seed, but it's surrounded by basically a giant balloon to where, once mature, it can break off in these flooding conditions and be transported, miles downstream. And kind of what we talked about with the seed anachronism is that, basically it's the parental plants are trying to find a way that they don't have to compete directly with their progeny. So here's a couple more pictures. These are more in dry conditions, most of them. I would say in the top left, a really great indicator to look for in these bottomland flat conditions is you can see kind of in that background tree, and I hope you can see it, is, the upper part of that bark is really bright. It's lichens. But once you hit a certain level, it's really, really dark. And that's because that area floods enough and frequently enough that it basically kills the lichen. And then a lot of times it floods frequently enough at the base of these trees, you'll find certain species of liverwort that basically have to have annual or more than annual inundation from floodwaters to even grow. And then that bottom left picture is a couple mallard ducks there, is these areas historically are really, really good for waterfowl. A lot of these oak species produce really small acorns that are highly digestible by waterfowl and are a great source of food for them. On the bottom right, you can kind of see a drift deposit is, flood events are great for moving around nutrients and coarse woody debris. They feed the floodplains and they feed the actual river systems, and they feed all the way down into, the bays and the Gulf system, and provide a lot of nutrient inputs to waters downstream from these large forested wetlands. In the middle are two of my favorite flowers within the system. The top one is aquatic milkweed, Asclepias perennis, and the bottom photo is American wisteria. I don't know if many of you knew this, but we have a native wisteria. Most of the ones we see, around urban areas is Chinese wisteria, but I like the American wisteria a lot more. And it's pretty common in good intact floodplain systems. And it's also in that Fabaceae or the legume family. And then you get these deeper areas. There's sloughs, which generally most sloughs are basically old abandoned channels. Or sometimes they are, a braided network. And we'll talk about that briefly on the next slide. And then you kind of normally have these back swamp areas that are kind of normally on the edges of the active floodplains, where there's normally like this little dip before you kind of hit the terrace, which the terraces are normally older floodplains that just don't get near the frequency of flooding that the active floodplains do. And this is where you get really, really tolerant species, water tupelo, which grows a lot of times with cypress. You only find it normally in East Texas. But mayhaw, which is you can eat mayhaw and make mayhaw jelly. It's in the hawthorn family. It's the hawthorns of Crataegus. Top right is water elm, and then buttonbush below that. So these species, can handle inundation almost year round, and depths up to a foot, 2-3 foot. Tupelo can get pretty deep. So they like these areas that just the sheer wetness of these areas really preclude a lot of the diversity, and you just get a couple species of woody plants that are capable of withstanding these long periods of deep water. And then here's a couple representative pictures. There's more cypress in here. You can see them top right. Those are the pneumatophores. The top left is some gum or tupelo. These big buttressing bases of trees is really common. Basically these plants are trying to distribute their weight within these soils that are waterlogged, high in organics, not very good to root in, because you got to realize beyond the water, they have to face hurricane winds frequently. So they're trying to just basically stay stabilized and keep the above ground, weight of the plant stabilized in these poor soil conditions. And in the bottom left, you can see the diversity of wading birds that are normally inhabiting these areas: spoonbills, wood storks, great egrets, great blue herons, ibis, the list goes on. And then my favorite sedge, well, I don't know if it's my favorite, but one of them is the top middle picture. That's cypress knee sedge, Carex decomposifolia or decomposita, it only grows on rotting cypress logs or cypress trees and pneumatophores, the knees basically. Really cool sedge. The closest place I know where to see it is Lake Isabel at the Lake Houston Wilderness, but it's a very nice species. And then just wanted to point out kind of the terracing system. So I like to utilize topographic maps when I look at a new area. And generally speaking, the maps from the 30s to the 50s are really, really good. They kind of give you an idea of where forested areas might be, so kind of the green. But they also show you, they normally have a lot better elevation lines with them. So you can kind of see here, I have, acidic runoff from uplands, and you can kind of see north and south of those arrows. Those lines are almost brown where those elevation gradients are kind of stacked against each other. So it's kind of like the extent of the Neches River, historic floodplains back in the Pleistocene when you had a lot bigger flood flows. And you can see them draining into kind of this big, broad swoosh or like a C shape with kind of that marshy symbol in there. And you can see how big that is. So that was the actual Neches River at some point. That's how big the river was. So it was getting a lot more flow to keep a channel like that open. But now that's like the fourth or the fifth terrace. So it's kind of like this fourth or fifth abandoned floodplain from back when the Neches system had that much flow, and now it doesn't. But you have a lot of runoff from the pine trees and more the upland conditions running into that feature that now doesn't get near the floodwaters that from the actual Neches system, but it gets a lot of standing water just because it's kind of a bowl shape. And that's where you get into a lot of the Bagall systems on these upper terracings, especially in the Neches and the Sabine drainages and their tributaries. And why they're called Bagalls is bay, so sweet bay and swamp bay. So Magnolia virginiana and swamp bay, Persea bonifera, I think. And then gall comes from gallberry, large gallberry. So it adds to the diversity of habitats you find within a pretty short amount of time within a lot of these, drainages and these upper parts of these historic floodplains, but they still feed down and tie in eventually into these more typically flooded situations associated with active floodplains. And then one more quick note is you can kind of see on this upper part on the right-hand side of the Neches River, all these kind of small little braided channels. That's called anastomosing. And anastomosing occurs when there's good soil for rooting and a lot of woody species. And you can see in the aerial how dense that area is. You can't even see those features. Those areas, those little side channels are really important for conveying flows. When the Neches River starts actually, busting its banks during flood stage. It really increases flooding capacity. And then kind of going back to that Bagall community type, they're normally really acidic. They have pHs of, around 4 to 5. And so you get a really distinctive species of plants there. They're normally very, very thick. They're normally shrub to sapling size, so 10 foot to 20 foot, 25 foot. Sometimes the gums will get 30, 40 foot, but they stay wet almost year round and really tannin rich water because a lot of times you have a lot of the pines basically leaching in from the uplands. So it's very dark brown water. And this is where you get, swamp tie, swamp gum, large gallberry, maleberry, which is Lyonia, sweetbag magnolia, and then red maple are really, really common. And then you also get species like some of the blueberries are pretty common in here. And then you get a decent amount of diversity in the understory with some of the herbaceous species, but they're normally pretty unique. And so just kind of wrapping up, I'm not sure necessarily, I wasn't timing myself how long I talked. Hopefully it's long enough. But just conclusions, I really like studying the geology and previous kind of climatic conditions to really kind of understand, both the original soil conditions of an area, and then also, maybe where kind of those distributional patterns, how they would have occurred over time, to why certain, groups of plants might be more common or more rare in an area, based on previous distributions to current climatic conditions. And then I think that, to think critically about these, abiotic or non-living factors is, if you start really accounting for topographic changes in climate, and how those would manifest themselves across a landscape, especially in relation to, flowing riverine systems, or just where is your water coming from. I think it really, at least for me, it allows for a lot more fun time when I'm out hiking or out in the wilderness. Is if you just do a little bit of homework up front and look at some, basic elevation, basic soil maps, it'll really help you get into a lot different vegetation communities more predictably, and allow for you to see if you're into that, which I know I'm just like to see as much diversity as I can. Allows you to really kind of maximize your time out in nature. And then going back to the similarity and differences is, the prairies and the flatwoods are more closed systems. They're really influenced by direct rainfall or the results of direct rainfall via overland flow, versus, the riverine systems, the stream systems are driven by, these large watersheds that there might not be any rain in the southern part of that Neches River system we looked at, but it still might be flooding to 20, 30 foot in some of those areas, just because of how big of an area, how big of a catchment it's actually sourcing water from. But I think if you look at both of them, just the topography really dictates where these different plant associations and niches kind of fall out. And it allows for a lot of predictability in what plants you would see where. And I think as you kind of learn over time, which it takes time to really kind of start developing an eye for those communities and where they would shake out. But it allows you to really explore these areas and get comfortable with them, and spot rarities where certain things occur. Like one of the really rare plants in East Texas is Texas corkscrew, Bartonia texana, and it occurs mostly in bay galls. So if you know that, you're not going to find it unless you're in that one thing. And then, human influence. We didn't talk too much about human influence, but just kind of a takeaway is, you don't see fire nearly as much now in Texas. It's mostly prescribed burns, and probably not nearly as frequently as it used to occur, and probably different time of year. Most of the burning in Texas takes place in the wintertime, and probably historically, the burnings would probably have occurred more with when fuel was dry. So summertime, when you had an aberrant lightning strike from a pop-up thunderstorm. So that can influence, how plants are over time. And then now with, the road systems and the dams, you just have a lot of modifications to hydrology, and then interactions, oftentimes between, plants even exchanging reproductive material. So I would say at this time, I'll take any questions. And below here, I have a series of books that I like. The first two are, the geology, and then the one below that is the geomorphology, which is, I think that really kind of digs into a lot of the processes that drive and shape the landscape. And then below that are some of the actual flora books I like, and the ecology books. I really enjoy the bottom one, the fire ecology of Florida. It's really pertinent to southeastern United States, and it's by Reed Noss, and it is a fantastic book with a lot of history in there. And I guess I will take these 4 questions. I've answered 2 in the Q&A. Tom says, real quick, let me see this. Could you comment on why the valley of Spring Creek is so wide and sandy, while the valley of nearby Cypress Creek is narrow and deeply incised? Sure. One, Spring Creek is I think a little bit bigger system. And so, creeks and rivers are scaled on watershed size. So the larger the watershed, the larger you would anticipate that being. And where did that question go? Oh, there it goes. Cypress Creek just not as large. And then Sandy. So if you look at the headwater of Spring Creek, it is started in the Willis Formation, which is a Miocene formation that's very, very, very sandy. I think it was kind of the edge of the Gulf and had a lot of dunes. And so the headwaters of Spring Creek source a lot of really big particles of sand. And you see that all the way down to the watershed into Lake Houston, where it confluences with West Fork Sandjack, which is why I do so much dredging in Lake Houston, because there's so much heavy sediment sourced from that watershed. So that's a very generic answer to your question, but it's roughly correct. Jan asked, was that milkweed food for monarchs? Yes, they would eat it. I don't see many monarchs on it, and I think that's because aquatic milkweed is pretty shade tolerant, and I just don't see a lot of monarchs in there. So I don't even know if I've ever seen a monarch larvae on aquatic milkweed, but I'm sure they'd eat it if they could. Do you find bald cypress on the Brazos? And if not, why? You know what? I don't know if I've ever seen. There might be a couple. I'm trying to think, what is that drainage? There's a park south of Houston. There's not a lot. And I think that part of the reason why there might not be as much is, so going back, kind of what we talked about in that last one, was the Brazos River is really sourced in central Texas and the Blackland Prairie, and it has a lot more basic soils and alkaline soils that, for whatever reason, it seems like it's just not as conducive to cypress. I think there are some maybe in the tributaries. You know what? I have seen a couple in the tributaries. I don't know. It's just not nearly as common as you would see in East Texas, but also I think that it's starting to kind of get to the range, kind of the western range extent of bald cypress. And for whatever reason, it's just does not appear to be nearly as common. Let's see, Sarah. One, how do you suggest seeing some of these locations, plant communities, any easily accessible spots near town? Sure. You know, the Arboretum has that. They are starting to open up, I would say, more of a Flatwoods community. And it's right there next to the parking areas, and it's starting to mature over time. They just had some goats in there, which is awesome, to eat back some of the blackberries. I would say they have a little prairie component that is by the pond, kind of on the eastern border. That's very nice. It's a nice prairie, Deer Park Prairie. I would say on this slide, the Big Thicket Plant Ecology by Geraldine Watson. You know, Big Thicket's hour to 2 hours away, different tracks. Really great examples of all these habitats within the Big Thicket. Definitely would check it out. It's one of my favorite parts of Texas, if not my favorite. I think Sean Benedict is on here. He's the area manager for the Sandylands. It's a nature conservancy property. Another great example of floodplain forest, really deep longleaf pine sand communities, bagels, very, very, very nice. And Sean does a great job of burning it to where you can actually see probably what this area would have looked like under proper fire regimes. And I would say that if you go there in November, early November, maybe late October, when the split-beard bluestem and little bluestem are blooming, if you go north of the pipeline on the main trail, on the Sandyland Trail, and you look back in the sun, it's one of the most beautiful sights you'll ever see in Texas, or at least I think so. So big kudos out to TNC and Sean. G. Baxter, what range of soils can longleaf pine grow in? You know, for the most part, I think they like the loams and the sands. And they're normally in higher or lower pH soils, so more acidic soils. I don't know if I've ever seen them on a heavy clay. Mostly sands. And they like at least some of that sandy component. And that partially could be they just do well in it, or they outcompete other people or other species. They have pretty extensive root networks. Verva, what conditions promote the large number of carnivorous plants, especially in the big thicket area? Yeah, that's pretty easy. So you got to think about carnivorous plants. They basically said we're going to form mechanisms to trap nutrients that are living, that are outside of this area. So nutrient poor conditions lead to carnivores. And then in the big thicket, it is, frequent soil saturations, leaching of all nutrients, to where highly acidic soils, really devoid of nutrients. And there's a lot to play in terms of just chemistry there, of where plants don't do a great job through their root systems grabbing nutrients. And so that's why these carnivorous plants basically found a mechanism to capture insects, and ants are a really common capture to basically source those nutrients from outside. So I already answered these, Marys and Clifton. So got these. Any other questions?
Andy, could you look in the chat?
Yeah.
I haven't.
No, the chat's too busy. Ask your question, Lynn.
What I was going to say is, would you consider leading a field trip or two after the pandemic ends?
Sure.
To illustrate some of the points that you were making?
Yeah, and that's the hard thing about, I think, this is like, it's a lot easier to see in person, obviously. You see the land undulating and see where the water stands and where it doesn't. And, I think that, and so I do a lot of wetland work, and just, digging, looking at soils really helps kind of understand some of these things, in terms of, you can see these soils, especially in those more carnivorous areas, of how much there's telltale signs, especially with iron and manganese and magnesium, to where how leached out these soils get, to where there's just not a lot of available nutrients for plants. Is there any more questions that you saw come out of the chat?
No, that
Lynn?
it was my question, whether you would consider leading the field trip. And if you would, maybe after the pandemic ends, we'll get back to you about that.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Great.
Okay.
I'll be out in the Neches floodplains this weekend.
All right.
Oh,
well.
So Pamela asked, will there be any sales or trade events this spring? Can you all answer that?
Oh, not from our end anyway. So no, I don't think so. We are starting a seed bank. So we're soliciting people to send donations of seeds, and then we will come up with a way to distribute them. Yeah, we're working on that program. We are currently planning wildscapes, and we hope to have a plant sale again, similar to like we did this past year, and it may or may not be a live event, but we're planning that right now, and it will be in the fall.
Hey, is there a way that if I PDF this slide deck, is there a way that y'all could share that on the website?
Sure.
Yes.
That way people can go back, and I know I went through a lot, so yeah. I know some of those figures can take some while, but I would say of the ones in the books below, the illustrated flora of East Texas, that's available as a free PDF on BRIT's Botanical Research Institute of Texas website. And I don't remember how I think you can get the whole PDF, but I think it has it broken up. So if you just download the introduction, it's got really great descriptions of the various kind of floristic communities of East Texas. It's a great resource, and I mean, it's free. So definitely worth checking out. And then Big Thicket Plant Ecology is a really great primer. It's pretty cheap on Amazon. doesn't go too much into like the nuance of the vegetation communities, but really gets into kind of how geology and kind of these abiotic factors shaped a lot of the southeastern Texas. So definitely worth checking out.
Okay. And yes, and we need to remind people that the Audubon has a native plant store year round.
And also, let's see, the video of this talk, thanks to Andy's permission, will also we'll upload it to YouTube. If you send us the PDF, we can just get a PDF of the slide linked on our website, but we also will have the YouTube available.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you very much. That was great.
They put a link to the Audubon store there at the bottom. So if you want to look, click on it now.
Yeah, at the at the chat.
Yeah.
Landed
chat.
Did I do a good job for a week's notice?
Oh yeah.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you very much for saving my life and giving a talk.
G. Baxter asked, where is the illustrative flora reference again? It's at the Botanical Research Institute of Texas's website, or if you just type in illustrative flora of East Texas in Google, it should probably pop up instantaneously. But they also have the flora of North Central Texas available, as well as a PDF. And another good one, PDF. You might have to write them. If you go to, I think, the University of North Carolina or Berea, they just published, I think, the flora of Carolina. Oh, who is that? I can't remember the name of the botanist. That one's really good too. Really, really good. I mean, because a lot of the plants are really similar. So that one's a good one to check out too for a free PDF. That's all I got.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Yes. So we will put it on the website on the page where our meetings are announced. And we will also put the PDF on Facebook attached to the event for this meeting. And then, of course, the video will be on YouTube and probably Facebook too. So we can also share the chat. So there's a few links in the chat. We can share that as well. It takes a little time though for Zoom to get the video and everything ready for us to download though. Okay. So I guess with that, we'll call it a night. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Andy.
See y'all.
Any questions? Okay. All that's left are thank yous. So good night.